discussion yesterday, for some reason, ended up around the question of war. So war plays a crucial role also, very obviously, in the present crisis. If we look at the...
I don't think they'll hear you.
Oh, right. Okay. If we look at the history of crises, then Mike had, of course, correctly referred to the Great Depression of the 19th century, about 20 years, which is really, I think, the background, if one wants to look at the history. Because from this point of view, there are three Great Depressions, I think. That one, 1929, and the present one. It was in the 19th century, during that period, that Rhodes made his famous remark about either you have imperialism or civil war. Engels, at roughly, I think just afterwards would come to an end, but roughly at that time, towards the end of the 19th century, was saying that the crises are getting ever more intense, ever deeper. In fact, of course, he was wrong if one just looks at what happened the next immediate period. Because of imperialism, in fact, crises became less intense. And the explanation for the fact that the crisis did not take the form that had been expected is precisely war and imperialism, the particular role of imperialism. For which reason, of course, it becomes hard, which is just a side issue, to simply go along with the viewpoint that the only effect of imperialism was to produce an aristocracy of labour. Quite obviously, it did more than that. It tended to make it somewhat easier for the entire working class of the developed world. That doesn't mean to say that one ends up with the viewpoint, which at least one person here holds, that the working class couldn't be militant. In fact, it was, and in fact, of course, as we know, the skilled working class tended to lead. So even actually the viewpoint put forward by Lenin turned out not to be wholly true. The period after that, of course, then after the war, which in itself brought the period to an end, as we know, then led up to the Great Depression of 1929, of which this looks in some ways like a duplicate, particularly in Britain. In some ways it does, in others, of course, it doesn't. The figure for the downturn in GNP at one point was identical, a 5% downturn in GDP. It's entirely different in the United States, where it went down far further, of course. Britain at this time, if you remember, was able to save itself to the degree that it did, precisely because of its empire. Introduced Commonwealth protection, something it cannot do today, of course. Which, of course, is one of the major reasons why Britain can't protect itself in the same way. But it did. Other countries took their own measures, as they did in Germany, of course. Well, that's very brief. We'll go back to the history of it. The 1930s, of course, were distinguished in this particular regard by the way in which, at first, the government deliberately set out not to intervene, and in fact even intensified the crisis by not decreasing the bank rate or increasing it. They were somewhat undermined intellectually, of course, by Keynes. Although at the times Keynes was actually writing, he wasn't supported by anybody else, by any other economist, as far as we know. Afterwards, he was. Obviously, that was a reflection of the change in attitude of the ruling class at the time. They realized it couldn't simply go on like that. And Keynes became an expression. That is the way I would understand it. That's a very brief introduction, as it were. It was the war which really brought it to an end. Now you can argue that it's only a number of measures introduced during the war which brings the Great Depression to an end. But it was the condition of the war which really did bring it to an end, which rather confirms the viewpoint of a number of Keynesians and the monthly review school of thought, which basically argues that capitalism naturally tends to stagnation. So it was only the war which, from that point of view, brought the Depression to an end. Well, factually that is true. I mean, it's impossible to deny that. The post-war period, precisely because they didn't want a repeat of what had happened before, did bring in the welfare state. And it is also true that between 45 and 1970 in Britain, standard of living rose, I think something like 3 times. It rose many more times than it had risen between 1800 and 1930. So it was a major change in the history of capitalism. Officially, they were using Keynesian measures, but in fact, what it boiled down to was the combination of the welfare state and permanent war. Because from 1945 to 46, as you know, the Cold War was maintained, and Cold War expenditure was crucial in this whole process. The combination of Cold War expenditure, Cold War controls, together with the welfare state, effectively stabilized capitalism. The weakness in that, which was always obvious, was that the working class could not be contained forever. In fact, it was contained partly for the reason just given, but very largely because of the previous history, because of the history of fascism of the Depression, and because of Stalinism itself. Once those aspects of history ceased to operate with quite the same strength, as we know during the 60s and 70s, the working class did react and did act. Did demand higher wages, or still higher wages, and a greater degree of control. Now, exactly how one understands that depends, of course, on what kind of Marxist one actually is, it seems to me. The way I understand it is precisely that because of that, the ruling class decided that enough was enough, and they were going to undo what they had done. We're going to go back in the welfare state and go back on full employment. The figures on unemployment are very clear, of course. I think in 1970, the percentage of the population, of the working population in Britain, which was inactive, was 1%. That's excluding students, obviously. Was about 1%. By the end of the century, it was among men, it was pretty close to 20%. The people who are nominally inactive, remember there's a difference between those who are inactive and those officially declared unemployed. I think most people know the difference by now. The Conservative Party certainly brought it out before the election. I think in Britain today it's something like, 8.2 million people of employment age who are economically inactive out of a total of 30 million. The Conservative Party usually argues that whatever it is, a few million people are not in work because they're just too lazy and just want to stay at home and watch TV. That's their argument. So the change effectively has been enormous. It's been a reduction in the welfare state and a deliberate decision to go for mass unemployment, which the present government seems to want to intensify. So one can understand why capitalism would do it, because if one looks at the controls, as I was arguing before, the basic controls under capitalism are commodity fetishism and the reserve army of labour. Necessarily, they would want to go back to both. They had both been greatly reduced during the immediate post-war period. The immediate post-war period did work, but it had come to an end by the 1960s when the working class began to act, as was entirely predictable, of course, not just by Marxists. The right also predicted that it couldn't last. Well, some Marxists, particularly since the middle 70s onwards, and that's become the dominant view among, I think, Marxists, argued that the rate of poverty was falling at this time, and for that reason, the ruling class switched. I just don't see that. I don't see either the statistics or any reason for it. It doesn't quite make sense to me. And of course, it wouldn't make much sense applied to the present, since quite obviously the rate of profit hasn't fallen in the present time, unless you have particular assumptions. But I'll come back to the question of the rate of profit. I'm only mentioning it to contrast with what I'm saying, because what I'm arguing is that it was precisely the class struggle which led the ruling class to shift its strategy. Well, if one looks at crises, and if you look at the present crisis, it consists really of three aspects to the crisis itself. There is what has become a cyclical crisis. I say what has become because you couldn't actually say that quite so easily in the 19th century. When Marx was talking about the 1857 crisis, he didn't just see it as an automatic cyclical crisis. He quite obviously saw it as a real crisis of the system. It was obviously, I say obviously because you can read in the text the way he was expecting much more than what actually happened. But he was obviously expecting it to be a real crisis of the system. Now, if you use the word crisis, you can't just be talking of a cycle. That doesn't make sense. I mean, if you're just going to go up and down, so what? Crisis has to be more than just going up and down. It must actually threaten the system. Otherwise, there is no crisis. There's simply an up and down movement. So, in fact, simply talking about the upturns and downturns of capitalist movement of the GDP or whatever else you want to use it, GDP being a pretty useless category generally, but sometimes one really does have to use it. So if we simply look at it going up and down like that, I don't think we're talking about crises. But that is the movement of capitalism. So what one is talking about is something more than that. And consequently, what I was just talking about was the 70s and the way the ruling class changed its strategy. And I think the second aspect in any crisis is the ruling class strategy. Now, that wouldn't have been true in the 19th century, as I'm just saying. But the fact is, we're not living in the 19th century, and the world has been going through a completely different period of, let's say, decline of capitalism, a period of transition. So the rules are not the same as they were in the 19th century, and therefore, simply to understand crises, as it were, in a purely technical way, doesn't seem to make any sense. That's again an allusion to the people who talk about the fallen rate of profit. So, the second aspect of a crisis, as today, is the question of the ruling class strategy. Now, what's also being said there is you can't simply look at any crisis which really is a crisis of the system. A crisis of the system implies the system may be overthrown, otherwise there is no crisis. If one's looking at it, the ruling class has to have a strategy for ruling. It has to have a strategy for dealing with economic change or a crisis to the system or a potential crisis to the system. Well, what I've been saying in this kind of introduction through history is to say that it has had to have a strategy, particularly since 1917, a strategy of ruling and a strategy of dealing with the changes within capitalism. The strategy it had adopted of 1945, as I indicated, was to use the welfare state combined with what amounted to a warfare state. That's a permanent war together with a welfare state. It's a combination of concession with repression, which is all that they actually have, of course, concession and repression. And again, since one has to argue that capitalism will come to an end, the only ultimate strategy the ruling class has got is one of delay. And these two aspects are two aspects of that delay, ensuring that delay. But, as I just said, that strategy had effectively come to an end. Strategy of containing the working class had effectively come to an end by the 60s and 70s. The working class, and particularly the rising working class, the youth, people going to work, students and so forth, were not bound by the previous history, where they weren't afraid of fascism. and they weren't afraid of the depression, and they couldn't be contained by Stalinism in the old way, or by social democracy. Precisely because of the decline of social democracy and Stalinism, they simply, together with the other historical aspects, they couldn't be contained. Logically, a new strategy had to be found. It wasn't new, it was simply a return to the old forms, which had come into being in the 19th century, of course, which is described by Lenin in particular, and of course he got the most of the conception from Hillel Ticktin in finance capital. So they switched to finance capital in the late 70s under the doctrine of monetarism. It was, at the time, a reasonably successful strategy. It did mean cutting down industry where they could and replanting it in other countries, third world countries, where they could pay a lot less and contain the working class far better. Insofar as they did that, and they've done that over the world, or done it most particularly in China, it has been successful. Up to a point, of course, but it's been successful. It does mean the nature of imperialism isn't identical to what it was, and it's one of the reasons, in discussing with Mike the question of war and imperialism, that it seems to me clear that we're not talking about imperialism in the same way. It's no longer a question of raw materials and a market for them to invade another country. They want to simply implant the entire industry in the other country and then leave it to that other country to get the market and get the raw materials. It is the same in the sense of the export of capital. But it does mean that a reason for war, or the reasons for war, become different, and the competition between imperialist countries also becomes different if it exists at any high level at all, which I doubt. So they switched, and as I said, it was successful. They did reduce the level of industry in a number of countries, Britain being the most obvious one. They'd already done it in Chile, in fact. And we know what the effect was. The effect was to reduce the number of people, I think, in manufacturing industry down to about 2.5 million. It was downsized by, I think, 3 times possibly, in terms of numbers, 2 or 3 times, in terms of numbers. The United States has not gone the same way as Britain, in the sense that it's not deindustrializing. What it's doing is shifting a number of plants, a number of industries, but not deindustrializing in general. One can't say that. It's quite obvious that the series of industries in the United States remain dominant in the world, even if they are relatively minor competitors, like, for instance, the airplane industry. Okay, there is an airplane industry in the Eurozone, and Britain builds wings. Now, for how long Britain will go on building wings is pretty doubtful, and Britain also builds engines for those planes. But the fact is that the US aeroplane industry isn't in danger of going under. It is, at the very least, an equal competitor to the Airbus. So the United States hasn't gone the same way as Britain, but it has certainly shifted a considerable amount of industry to China and elsewhere. Britain has gone furthest, but one would expect it, because it is the country of finance capital, where finance capital first came to be, and which has maintained itself. It's true the dominant finance capitalist power became the United States and not Britain. But essentially what that means, if one's talking about finance capital, is a shift to finance as opposed to industry. And the whole point, of course, is that finance capital is that it is unproductive. I've already given the figure of the number of people actually directly involved. The number of people indirectly involved in Britain is considerably higher, of course. Exactly what counts as GDP is something else. But there are various figures depending on how you actually define finance capital, which can be quite high as a percentage of the GDP in Britain. But the whole point about finance capital, I've said this several times, so I won't go too far, is that it wants the highest possible return in as short a time as possible. Again, in different words, Marx more or less says that in the Grundrisse, that you can look at the circuit of capital and you can see that in the case of manufacturing, direct industry, it has a location, a specific location, and it is involved in direct production. It's involved with the embedding of labor time. In contrast, finance capital is in circulation, and it simply wants to get the return, to get through the period in which it is in circulation as fast as possible, not caring for anything else. And it can be anywhere in the world. It has no location. It is necessarily global. Industrial capital has to have a location. It can't be on the moon. It has to be somewhere. For that reason, finance capital is necessarily international, and industrial capital at this time has to be national. It can be multinational if you want, but it has to have a location. In practice, in fact, it tends to be national. You therefore get an automatic division, as it were, between capital, which is national, and very often the working class, which is national or national-based, and tends often to tend sometimes, would tend towards becoming more nationalist as opposed to finance capital, which, in contrast to its earlier period, would tend to be less nationalist. Well, that's very obvious if we look at the attitude to immigration, which both in the United States and here, the big capital wants effectively to have an open country so that they can exploit labor directly, whereas labor has an interest in stopping it. So it's necessarily parasitic because it's deriving its value from industry. It's deriving its value from the productive sector. So it's necessarily parasitic. And as a parasite, it tends to destroy its host. That's brought out in great detail by Lenin, of course. Now again, we've seen that very obviously, where private equity has bought up productive firms, sold off their property portfolios and other saleable assets, and then just returned it to the rest of the country, to the stock market, insofar as there still is a company. So they effectively destroy the company while getting a considerable profit. In Russia, they took it to the absolute extreme, where they sold off all the property and all the physical assets and totally destroyed the company, and succeeded in making quite a lot of money as they do it. It's an amazing period of history, but that is what they've been doing and will continue to do as far as one can see. In more benign cases, finance capital has demanded high returns from industrial firms, in which investment funds, whether insurance, pension, or other funds, might have substantial holdings. And these companies were often forced to reduce their research departments, increase surveillance and the targeting of staff. In other words, it is finance capital which introduced and enforces what's called a neoliberal strategy. Neoliberalism is actually the wrong word, and I prefer not to use it, because it's simply the strategy of finance capital as applied to various fields, including the industry itself. The result, of course, is that while formal efficiency can improve, in fact, employees would only perform under stress as far as they can be measured. Long-term returns are therefore reduced in the industry as well as in finance capital. So necessarily such a strategy has a limited life. It can only have a limited life since it is short-termist in every aspect. And very obviously it's true of industry, where returns are bound to go down over time. The point of all this is that was the strategy which was introduced under the name used by the left or semi-left of neoliberalism, and that it would necessarily have a limited life, which is what I've just said. However, it was successful, and it was successful effectively in containing, I wouldn't say defeating, but containing the working class. And it was a period in which profits were transferred to finance capital. For industry, it meant, of course, relatively reduced profits. But it was also a period where, precisely because it was finance capital, where you had a relatively small number of people controlling huge levels of funds, where they could reward themselves with huge returns. And it meant precisely that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. It's an automatic consequence of it. It meant also, of course, that their comparators in industry similarly had huge salaries. When one has salaries of $2 billion a year, 2-3 years ago, some person in the United States, whom I've now forgotten, had a salary of $2 billion a year, you ask exactly what that means. I think Michael Eisner, I think it was, of Disney had a salary about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, before he left Disney, or something like 200 million. Never mind bonuses, just salaries. What it meant wasn't, in other words, just to kind of repeat myself in a different way, what it meant wasn't just that you had a separate sector of finance capital, which would involve banks, insurance companies, effectively pension funds and so forth. It didn't just have a finance capital sector. It also meant that industry was subordinated to it. Of course, industry had to, in effect, have a separate finance capital section to deal with its own business, precisely because of the fluctuations within the capital system itself, as in the case of currencies. But it wasn't only currencies, interest rates, currencies, etc. That automatically led, although it began in the early 80s, it automatically led to what we call derivatives now, which took off at the beginning of the 21st century. I've talked about this many times, I think, given the figures from year to year. I remember bringing it up in 2002, when it was roughly 200 trillion, the total value of derivatives, using value in a bourgeois sense, was 200 trillion then. It was then that Warren Buffett said that they were financial weapons of mass destruction. Well, the history of Warren Buffett is something else, which I'll come back to. Anyway, he was of course correct, except that he managed to stand on his head by buying a huge quantity of them himself, and then getting the senator from Nebraska, which is where he is, to oppose the present government's attempted tax on derivatives. Having bought something, I think he bought something like 64 trillion. I don't remember what it was. Anyway, it was a huge, 64 billion. It was a huge quantity of derivatives. Having bought so much himself, he didn't want to make a loss. So he got the senator from Nebraska to oppose the bill, and won. So one can hardly regard him as anything but a hypocrite. But that's again a side issue. The point is, he did bring it out, imply that one shouldn't touch them and that they would explode, which they of course did. As I say, I remember roughly in 2002 at the communist, at a previous number of this institution. But today that figure is more than 3 times, or rather the end of 2008, I think it was something like 680 trillion. So it's been expanding all the time, and in fact it continues to do so. I don't know if you noticed, but in the papers they brought out that on the New York Stock Exchange, I think more money is actually spent on derivatives today than on stocks and shares. Well, of course, it's a reflection of the nature of capitalism today, the nature of capital today. Anyway, the essential point is that what one's talking about is something which inherently is unstable, and it was very obvious it would explode. And again, I remember saying that several times, that it was bound to go. Well, you didn't have the genius to actually work out that if you have an institution which is far more risky even than the stock exchange, the thing would explode. Of course, it's again obvious that there'll be parts of it which are more risky than others, and the particular part of it which did explode was the mortgage section. I don't suppose you want to go into the technicalities of what happened there, so I'll just actually leave it out. But essentially, what is behind all this is the fact that capital is shifted to finance capital as a strategy. What that meant was that capital recognized that they had effectively a surplus of capital which they didn't want to invest in the industry itself or in expanding industrial production, or if you want, the productive sector. It meant that there was a huge surplus of capital, and you can see that expressed in the figures I've just quoted. And you're talking of, and again I've quoted this before, but I have to do it now talking of a crisis, you're talking of something like $18 trillion just being held in banks. That's just money. And it's a huge quantity of money, effectively held by individuals, and they're just not putting it into industry. They're not investing it. It's just left in banks to invest. They prefer a rate of interest. As I said, I've quoted this before, so it was reported in the papers quite extensively. The figure could well be a lot higher than that. At the same time, you're also talking of figures directly held, figures of money directly held by the finance capitalist institutions. Let's say like insurance companies, banks, etc., pension funds, of something like, this is a couple of years ago, something like $110 trillion. Now remember, world GDP is around 54 trillion. So these figures are absolutely enormous, and they're in money. And they have considerable problem in actually investing them to get the returns which they actually want. And they simply held, as it were. It's not surprising, therefore, you get private equity acting the way it is. For that reason, the attack on the banks is stupid. It's not the banks which caused the crisis. The banks were simply acting under instruction from the capitalist class or the wealthy, if you want to say. Those people who had money, those institutions had money, wanted the highest return they could get. Naturally, the banks would do what they could in order to get it, so they would speculate one way or another. And since they were competing, they would compete in the way they did. It's true they competed in giving mortgages, but what's wrong with giving mortgages to the poor? No reason why we should condemn them for that. Very good. And insofar as people have managed to keep their houses, in fact, it was a step forward. I mean, looked at objectively. So it is ridiculous to simply attack the banks. The banks are not responsible. The banks are simply the intermediate institution between the capitalist class and the investment itself. Of course, it's true that the bankers, the investment banks in particular, but the bankers in general took huge sums for themselves, or rather took huge sums for those who were in executive positions. The managers got huge sums, took a huge cut for the process. But again, one is within capitalism, and after all, at some level, one can talk of corruption being normal. And one would expect that if people are handling money unless you expect them to simply pocket the money, you must give them money. Otherwise, they will take it one way or another. So when handling money, in other words, you have to give people who are handling money lots of money. Even the person who would collect the dustbin has to be kept quiet in case they pick up information in the dustbin, which would put someone in jail. So it's always important to pay people within finance capital quite well. It would appear to me. So I just made the point that what the attack on the banks is, or in effect, a deliberate or maybe an unconscious strategy, though it looks like a deliberate strategy to divert attention from the capitalist system itself. It's the system which is the problem. And the problem there is the existence of surplus capital. The fact that the capitalist class does not want to go back to full employment. It doesn't want to expand industry in the way it was doing it in the 70s or before the 70s. It's afraid of the working class. Now, as I said, go back to the question of the foreign rate of profit. The dominant viewpoint within Marxist economists is that there's a declining rate of profit. Consequently, they can't invest because the rate of return is so low, or there is no rate of return. But that completely contradicts the obvious reality that in the United States, the standard of living or the return or the wages or whatever of the vast majority, or at least 3/4 of the population, is at least static. For sections, of course, has gone down since 1973. And at the same time, the rate of profit in the United States is between 12 and 20%. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't add up to talk of a falling rate of profit. You can play around with the figures, which is what somebody like Andrew Kleeman does, and other people do as well. Paul Cockshott does the same thing. And that is, you could try and deduct the unproductive expenditure from profits. But why do you deduct it? And if you deduct it, you get a rate of falling rate of profit. But as I pointed out before, the unproductive expenditure is now huge. So of course you'll get a falling rate of profit. But why deduct it? Where does unproductive expenditure come from? From profits. It is part of profit. So, in my view, it's simply wrong. And if one simply looks at it, looks at those figures, or looks at it theoretically, it is simply wrong. Paul Cockshott has put up graphs showing more or less the same, showing precisely what I just said, that the rate of profit appears to go up, but you take out unproductive expenditure and therefore it goes down. But I say, in theoretical terms, it makes no sense. Well, having said that, one's back to the fundamental causes of the crisis, which in the end amount to saying that the strategy adopted by the ruling class, finance capital, has come to an end. The previous strategy was based on welfare state, a series of political conditions, and above all by the Cold War. The Cold War has come to an end. The strategy of finance capital has necessarily come to an end, and we see increasing degrees of control over finance capital. It's not that it ceased to exist, but it cannot operate in the old way. There's, of course, something more than that underlying it. Well, why is there this surplus of capital? I just said, well, the strategy of capital was to get away from expanding industry. And that remains the case. It still remains the case that they are afraid to reflate. They have been afraid to reflate now for at least 20, 30 years. There's nothing to stop the government's putting more money. We'll talk about it tomorrow, no doubt. There's nothing to stop the ruling class pumping more money into the system. The idea that this or that will happen is just nonsense. As I say, we'll talk about it again tomorrow because it involves the question, the political questions, precisely of the present, of the Conservative Party budget and so on, and for the matter, the budget of the United States. But very generally, there is no reason why it can't do it. I mean, we time and again get all these economists and journalists and so forth saying that they can do it. So there's no reason why they can't. The fundamental reason they don't want to do it, in the end, is political. They're afraid of expanding production precisely because it will reinforce the militancy or make possible a militancy which otherwise would not exist or would not be able to exist. For that reason, they won't do it. But again, what lies behind that, very briefly? I think when looking at political economy or theoretical political economy, it is usual to say that there are three aspects of any crisis, let's say in the 19th century, in fact. Falling rate of profit, disproportionality, and underconsumption. Now, most Marxists have ruled out underconsumption on the grounds that it is reformist. Now, I agree myself that underconsumption can never be a fundamental cause of crisis. However, you cannot rule it out simply because it is reformist. That is, in methodological terms, simply wrong. You have to discover whether it works or doesn't work, not whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. But it so happens that underconsumption causes a crisis, then it causes a crisis, whether it's reformist or not. So, but that's generally the attitude, and I think that's just wrong. Now, of course, it's true that the capitalist class doesn't have to put its money simply into selling consumer goods. It can invest, and that its profit would tend to go towards investment. So you have the division between the investment goods or producer goods and consumer goods. So you could get a Department 1 which was self-expanding, as it were, over time. It can't always be like that, but it can for a period of time. And for that reason, the underconsumption argument doesn't seem in itself an argument which is correct. It can only be part of a crisis. It can't be the whole crisis. In the end, one has to find a reason why the reinvestment can't take place. So, and that is the case, it seems to me. Well, what one's looking at is the fact that war expenditure cannot continue in the old way. I think Mike pointed out the number of wars which have taken place. It's true. I don't think there's been any period since 1945 when there hasn't been a war, and of course we've been talking of a long period of Cold War. The whole point about war is that it is a wonderful instrument under capitalism for wasting money. It's wonderful in the sense that it's a nationalized form which is acceptable because war has been taking place among mankind for thousands of years, and that it be a nationalized form is what one would expect. You don't call it a nationalized form, but it is a nationalized form. Nobody expects today, despite the fact that there are a number of mercenary troops, that generally the troops be simply mercenaries, or that there be private firms, and only private firms, which are making goods and the government doesn't buy them, or the government doesn't get involved. So one expects the government to do it. It's acceptable. It's acceptable to private property that you have a nationalized form of war. It's completely acceptable. Of course, it's acceptable historically, but it's also acceptable because with war goes discipline, control. And for that reason, the United States, the military sector has been absolutely crucial all throughout. The problem, of course, is that they need more wars. And again, Mike also pointed this out, that the war on terror was supposed to be a substitute. It's true, for the end of the Cold War. But it failed hopelessly. Nobody takes that seriously at all. It's not, and of course even Brown brought the title to an end. There's no war on terror. It doesn't make sense to take a war on terror. And the intention was to compare it to the Cold War. Of course it didn't work. And again, I've brought out these figures several times, but the percentage of GDP which actually goes to military expenditure has gone down and went down consistently from the huge level which it reached under Reagan, where he brought the country out of a recession, which was over 8 percentage points, but of course that's of total GDP. It went down to something like 3%, and under Bush it went up about 1 percentage point. I think the figure now is something like 700 billion. But as a percentage, although it has gone up, of course, because of the Iraq and Afghan war, it hasn't gone up anywhere near to the previous figure, which it had been under Reagan, which they necessarily need. They can't do it any longer. Why can't they do it? Because it would involve extra taxes the capital class doesn't want to pay, and they can't tax the working class anymore without some sort of result. So they simply can't do it. It's extremely difficult. Well, putting it differently, their strategy has failed. What I've been arguing is, just to summarize, is that if we look at the question of crisis in theoretical terms, we cannot simply use the classical three forms and leave out government expenditure, because it's quite obvious that governments have been crucial to the economy all throughout. We have to look at it and combine what is happening there with the more general theory in order to work out what actually is happening and what is likely to happen. In other words, it's much more politicized than it was. It is a political economy. One can't just assume that we have an automatically operating capitalist economy like in the 19th century. We quite evidently don't. Governments play today an enormous role in the economy, and they have to be incorporated into any theory. And I've tried to incorporate that by talking of a strategy which the capitalist class adopts in order to maintain stability. What I've tried to argue finally in this is that, in fact, they're left with nothing today. The alternative strategy was finance capital, as I pointed out. It has stopped working. It continues to exist, but it no longer can operate in the same way. It can't establish the same level of stability. Logically, they should reflate, but they will not dare to reflate. The only other strategy they're left with, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is complete defeat of the working class and restoration, as it were, of the controls which existed in the 19th century. That sounds to me like something absolutely utopian and impossible. It is, as it were, as if talking of Britain alone, but the Conservative Party is expressing the same viewpoints as the Republican Party. It looks as if they've simply decided that they'll just have to go for broke because there is no alternative. Thank you. Cecile, of course. It's perfectly true that we don't have the value statistics. That's quite true. So it's extremely difficult to work out values since we don't have them, and it's very difficult to calculate. Secondly, to try and work out the falling rate of profit of, say, Britain or the United States, we have a real problem in that something like half of profits come from overseas, which I think is a good point. How do you then work that out in terms of the organic composition of capital? Are you going to go look at all the different countries, work out the organic composition of capital? Nobody's done that. When you actually look at the figures, they simply assume that the profits don't come from overseas. The usual figures are for the United States or from that of Britain. They usually just assume that they're national, but they're not. So the figures are really dubious. That doesn't mean to say that it has no effect. I agree with Cecile. Of course it has an effect. We're not 100% certain, but exactly what the effect is. But one obvious effect is that there is a limit. A certain amount of value is produced, and there is a limit. There's a limit, therefore, to surplus value. But we don't exactly know that for the reason that Cecile gave. I think that's true. Of course, that would mean if we simply did not calculating it, and we don't know how to calculate as well, that it's potentially possible. That's true, but we don't immediately see it. What he said too, that it was a cult, and I've been saying that several times over. It is a cult to simply take the ordinary profit. What's wrong with it is that it is virtually doing what no Marxist should ever do: turn a class relation into a thing, rather than seeing the class relation and the rate of profit as one thing, as it were. Peter asks the question of how the capitalist class acts in order to shift from industrial capital to finance capital. Well, okay, how did they decide this? Well, let's begin with the first point. They clearly did decide it because that's exactly what did happen. That links with Nick, who says, I've forgotten who the person is, well, somebody or other said that corporations were in America.
He says throughout the world.
Throughout the world. Corporations...
most of them in the US and here.
Okay. Corporations are increasingly self-financing. I'm not clear what he's saying there, because they were self-financing from the 1930s in the United States. Up to the 30s, the banks were crucial to, roughly to the 30s, the banks were crucial to the financing of industrial corporations. From roughly the 1930s, the retained earnings were enough, which then actually created a problem, because they then had excess finances. But so I'm not clear what he's actually saying there, because it's been true for a very long time. And again, you would have to divide it between the large corporations and the small and medium-sized enterprises, because again, since the restoration of finance capital, there's been a stress, particularly, a stress on small and medium-sized enterprises, and generally they're not self-financing, or they're self-financing, but they require banks or other financial houses to assist them. Now, that's quite obvious at the present time, when the government keeps moaning on about how the banks are not financing them, and they keep complaining they don't have enough finance. So it's clear that at that level, that the banks are absolutely crucial. At the crucial level of the big corporations, which, unlike what the economists and the government says, are the basis of the economy, rather than the small and medium-sized enterprise, even if there are millions more small and medium-sized enterprises. It's true, they were self-financing for a very long time, and you'd expect them to be that. There is I don't think that really alters the point. It's not so much that they would go to banks for loans, because they are often so big. You think of General Electric, which is both financial and industrial, of course. Obviously, it can finance itself if only from its financial sector. But in that case, it's something intermediate between a financial and an industrial firm. But if you're thinking of a company which is actually making profits, as opposed to the car companies, which clearly had to get money from banks and had to get the loan, then what they would tend to do, as you see recently, is issue more shares. It's much easier for them to issue more shares than to, if they can, than to do it the other way around, to go to a bank, in which case they are dependent on the bank. But for that, they have to be increasing in size, and the shareholders don't want to have their dividends diluted. Yes. So it's, but if they are growing, then they can, of course, do that, and they do that if they want to. On top of which, you get this constant tendency for them to take over other firms, where they may have to get money either from banks or from shareholders. So it is very much there. However, leaving all that aside, the question remains, and in fact, in a certain sense, is reinforced by what you said. What do they do with their profits? What do the big industrial corporations do with their profits? Can they simply expand? Do they simply expand? Well, that's the issue. It's not an accident that General Electric, which after all is the biggest industrial firm, if you want, in the United States, is to whatever extent, half, let's say, a finance capitalist firm. So what that then goes down to is the rate of return. Well, the implication of what I was saying was that the rate of return in the 70s did decline. Now, people who want to argue the rate of profit is declining do argue that in terms of the rising of organic composition of capital. But as Cecile said, and I've said many times, there's no proof of that at all. Now, it's not that it's impossible to prove that it's caused by a rising organic composition of capital, but you'd require a whole institute or maybe a whole country to do it, because it's a lot of work to work out that statistics. converting them from prices into value to see what is actually happening behind that. And nobody's actually done that. I mean, what you've got is the so-called Acacia theorem, which simply elides everything, and which I think is pretty dubious. But then you get involved with what I just said. How do you deal with unproductive expenditure? So it really, it might be, it is theoretically possible, and it is practically possible if you've got enough people to do it. But no Marx Institute, or I don't know if any Marx Institute exists actually, but no collection of Marxists has managed to do this. So let's just leave it aside. As far as I can see, it's not true. You don't need it, of course, and historically the division between Marxists of the kind which I'm implying goes back to then. Did the rate of profit decline in the 70s because of increasing action of the working class, or did it decline because of the decline in the rate of profit due to a rising organic composition of capital? Okay. Now, there's no question that, of course, if workers strike, if workers demand higher wages and receive some level of concessions, or even if they just strike, your rate of profit will go down. And even if it doesn't go down, it'll be threatened. The result will be that, of course, you have to have a strategy for actually dealing with it. That's its logic. And that's basically what I was talking about. Okay, so logically then, it's not that the industry goes under, but they do what General Electric did, put a lot more into finance capital, or alternatively, they put a section of their profit into a finance capitalist firm. Or there'll be 101 ways which they can do it. Or, which is what also happens, they pay their executives enormous sums, who in turn go off and acquire some private equity firm, if you want. So there have been ways in which, in other words, and there are very obvious ways in which they interrelate in that way. Having said that, all is not sweet and light in that. The biggest industrial firm in Britain used to be General Electric Corporation, if you remember, until Weinstock resigned and was replaced by an idiot. It was there, who proceeded to invest in, I think it was telecommunications, and completely failed, and the firm ceased to exist. Now, that was the biggest industrial firm in Britain until about 1998, 1999. If you read what Weinstock had to say at the point where he was retiring, it occupied, I think, a whole page of the Financial Times. Most of it was almost extreme vituperation against the City of London, an absolute hatred of finance capital. Now, why do you hate finance capital like that? Because he said, I just go to them, I ask them for advice, which he has to go to. It's not that he was in debt to the banks. I go to them for advice on whatever it is, taking over a company or bidding for something or other, and they charge me 200 million. So the enormous sums are given to them for no good reason whatsoever. That's the interconnection, and that's why. It's not that they loved one another, they don't. You can't today simply operate as an industrial company and not interconnect with finance. Just consider what you do about, let's say, again, you're talking of an industrial firm which sells electric goods, as in the case of General Electric. They were selling hot point washing machines, which of course are completely useless naturally. But anyway, they were selling them. Let's assume that they were selling them to some unfortunate country. Now, the problem there for them, just to say, the two problems there. One is that the currencies fluctuate. So although at any one time they may be making a profit of 15%, all of a sudden the other country's currency could turn against them, as it were, the terms could turn against them, and they make a 30% loss. So all corporations, therefore, take out insurance on that. That's now called a derivative. For that, they have to go to finance capital and pay for it. The same is true of interest rates, because let's say they don't need to finance the selling of the thing. The other side needs to finance it. But they have to provide the finance to the other company. They go to a finance corporation. As you know, if you go in to buy a car, the car firm will find a financial firm, usually a bank, to give you the money so that you can buy it on HP. Well, it's similar for any industrial corporation. I'm just giving you two examples. So the interconnection is there, and they are dependent on finance in that particular way. So it's very clearly there. And it is totally parasitic. As I said, Weinstock hated them. And if you are a corporation of that kind, you will hate them. And why on earth should you have to pay them these enormous sums anyway? And you would think, basing on anything else, you'd pay a tiny fraction of that. So it makes no sense, abstractly, but that is the way it actually runs. You raised the question also of bubbles and so forth, just said, just for a time. Well, I deliberately didn't bring it up because that is one of the theories as well of the present crisis, which I think is just nonsense. The bubble is a consequence. It is not a cause. I mean, you rightly brought out what actually was going on, but if what you've got is a position where finance capital has these huge sums, and they are ultimately derived from industrial capital, or for that matter, industrial capital doesn't want to reinvest because it doesn't see a market, or the profit rate will be lower for them. Then where do they put it? And what they've been doing is, of course, not just putting it in banks. They've been putting it into property, into land, into buildings, and so forth. Now, of course, if there's a huge sum of money going into a limited amount of property, which is necessarily limited, you will have an asset inflation. And that's precisely what has happened. And it's continuing to happen. And what links with that is, of course, something else which I didn't bring up. And that is that if you have a 19th century type upturn and downturn, or for that matter, again, which something I didn't raise, the kind of upturns and downturns, cyclical ones we had until recently, then what tends to happen is that the wages go down and the cost of capital itself goes down, the capital is destroyed. So you get a natural upturn. That didn't happen, as people are arguing correctly, that didn't happen in the 1989-1993 downturn. That's to say, industry was protected. That didn't happen either from March 2000, and it's not happening now. The present time, it's actually happening only to a very limited extent to the finance capital which we're talking about. You're talking about the total funds held in banks that went down from 18 to 14 trillion. 14 trillion is quite a lot of money, and they managed to recuperate, in fact. So you've still got the same position. The logic of it is, if they simply let it go, another asset bubble. They know that. They know that if they let it go, we have another asset bubble. And they wouldn't be able to control it. It's why property prices aren't going down as fast as you might have thought they would have gone down, or are stable. But the cause isn't in itself. It is what I've just given, the huge levels of surplus capital, which they are not prepared to wipe out. That's the ultimate reason. And finally, what lies in turn behind that is that you can't leave out the government from this. You can't act as if it's just a capitalist class and a working class, and the government somehow stands in between, as liberal theory has it. The government will act, of course, in the interest of the capitalist class in this case. And it was governments which switched. You remember the Labour government said, we are monetarists today. This is in the 70s. Of course, that was very obvious in the case of Thatcher. And it does change the terms. You remember I think I mentioned it, but anyway, the numbers involved, the manufacturing industry went down to something like 2.5 million in Britain. Was that 3 million people who lost their jobs? So it wasn't the capital class directly doing it, the government did it. So behind that in turn is that I do think the capitalist class exists as a class. And I think the theory which was around capital and class, this kind of semi-autonomous theory that it only exists with the state, is absolute rubbish. You just read some of the accounts of how there are these clubs in New York of the rich where they discuss this sort of thing. Of course they do. Well, what else would you expect them to do? Just sit around and let their wealth go? Obviously they will speak to one another. They speak to one another even if they didn't have these special clubs. They speak to one another in parties, or they speak to another in corporations, because consider the corporations, the board of directors, who's actually on it. Yeah, that's, if you look at any large corporation, you'll see that the members of the board of its boards usually are on 101 other boards. It's formed, as it were, almost automatically, because they're interconnecting all the time. That's apart from the fact that they'll meet one another in church, in weddings, God knows. They're interconnecting all the time and discussing this sort of thing, because the only thing that in the end will motivate somebody who accumulates, that is the law of his profits according to Marx, is money. That is what's fundamentally motivating him. Okay, a number of them manage to fall out of it, but in general, money is absolutely crucial for them, so they'll be discussing it all the time. The idea that there isn't a class it's just nonsense. There is a class. It does meet, it does discuss. It's true there are different sections of it, and you can argue at various times if it tends to fall apart. It's no longer a class, it's individual, but it comes back together again. It's also true, talking of it as a class, that the Cold War was wonderful in that respect, because it did give them a series of collective institutions. Now, so for all the wrong reasons there were, because the Soviet Union wasn't going to invade, because it couldn't invade, it was far weaker, there was no reason for a war, and all the rest of it, but that made no difference. The fact is, officially, the Soviet Union was going to invade. It was the most horrible country in the world, which was true to a large extent. But the fact is, there was no real reason for them to have a Cold War in those terms. However, it did serve the function of providing a whole series of institutions where they interconnected. And it's not an accident, therefore, you had in Italy this, what is it, P2?
Lodge.
Yes.
Back.
Yeah, but it is P2.
P2, yeah.
Yeah, so we don't know all the institutions, of course. I mean, all we know is things like the World Economic Forum, where they do, in fact, in secret sessions, meet one another, as I gather from at least one person who was there. So we know of the Bilderberg Conference and so forth. No doubt there are others which we are just completely secret or much smaller or whatever. And they will discuss what they think should be done. And it doesn't have to be fully worked out. It could be partially worked out. The working out of it can be left to the governments. Okay. Mike brought out the question of banking, really, and money. Now, I actually don't agree with the whole thesis you put forward, but the fact is that when the money crisis broke out, what do we call it? The capitalist class investors, big banks, actually did think they were in trouble, not as banks, but as the capitalist system. That's why the stock exchange went through the floor. I think I quoted in critique, J.P. Morgan giving advice to its investors, the people who give it money in order to invest, where it said, it's perfectly possible that Marx was right, the contradictions of the capitalist system will now show themselves to be overthrown. They actually said that, but then went on to give advice. At the time, I quoted it, and I sort of half believed it. But since then, speaking to various people, it does seem as if it's true. They actually lost confidence in the capitalist system. They actually did think it would go, or could go. So in that sense, at least they thought the system could go, even if Marxists didn't. Of course, the point, there's obviously a difference between the objective and the subjective. The point is that objectively, it is in the gravest trouble it has been since the 1930s, without question. Objectively, subjectively, it's in no trouble. Nobody believes it'll be overthrown simply because there's no party to overthrow it. And the working class is not in a position to overthrow it at the present time. That is obvious, but I think the capitalist class is much more worried than you are. That's my impression from reading this stuff. They are. Now, why is that? It's because there is no actual solution to this crisis. You're not going to go up and down. there is an up and down, there's an up now. But, in this up, you read the Financial Times yesterday, and it says in one of its headline here, Fed set to downgrade outlook for US. What kind of upturn is it? It's an upturn in which they're downgrading the outlook.
Dead cat bounce.
Pardon?
Dead cat bounce.
Dead cat bounce, yeah. Well, the general line is stagnation. And what I try to outline is the fact that whichever way they turn, it just doesn't work. They don't have another strategy, except a kind of total strategy of defeat. But they don't really have one which is likely to work. That's why it is a crisis, it's an objective crisis for the system. They have no way out, as it were. But they can go on, just as it were, a zombie, whatever you want. You've got zombie capitalism from that point, which will just go on. It'll stagnate. If you look at the rate of growth in the last period before the crisis, it was low. And it was historically low in the period. It was the lowest historical period, the lowest rate of growth in any historical period since 1945, being 2000, 2007, which is part of the whole deal. It's clear they know they're in trouble. At the same, and that's why they're acting the way they're acting. But of course, subjectively, there is no party to overthrow it. It is easily the most exciting, interesting time for Marxists since 1945.
Interesting.
Well, it's the most excruciating type of time for anybody who's employed, as it were, given the possibility of being unemployed. But it is the most interesting time for Marxists in a sense because the possibilities are so great. And so it is a crisis for the system objectively, but of course there has to be this subjective element. The subjective element has been effectively contained by the previous history, which amounts to social democracy and Stalinism, which, if you go back to it, ultimately was a wonderful strategy for capitalism itself. So perfectly conscious about what was happening, both with Stalinism and social democracy. But that's the time in which we live. If the objective changes, one would expect the subjective will also change. Or putting it another way, the idea that capitalism would simply change without an objective change is nonsense. Capitalism did actually deliver to people in the developed country. Standard of living was rising. They had a good reason to say things are not that bad. After all, they're much worse than the Soviet Union. We don't want the Soviet Union. So there are good reasons why, as it were, people would not turn to socialism. Those good reasons are no longer there. There's an objective reason now for people to say we want another system. The problem for us is that you have to show that socialism can do it. There will not be another Soviet Union, or alternatively, you'll not have to go through a series of civil wars in which half the population are killed. Nobody wants to be killed. It's much better to have a lower standard of living. So that's the problem, not the objective problem anymore, as it were. And that's why it's so much worse for most people and so much has so much potential that I think we can say they really are in a crisis. Mike has brought up a million and one questions, it seems to me. I can't do justice to what he just said. Marx discusses crisis most clearly, or most pages if you want, if you remember, in the second volume of Theory of Surplus Value, where he's talking about Ricardo. And it's there that he, talking of underconsumption, in fact, says it's the childish, talking of Say's law, that supply creates its own demand. He says it's a childish babbling of a Say, unworthy of a Ricardo. The way he describes it, in fact, what he's describing over there, in which he goes through Say's law and shows how it doesn't work, is to begin with consumption. But what he does there is go through the contradictions within the system. Now, underconsumption is part of the crisis. It may not be the primary cause, as Mike is right to say, but it is very much part of the crisis. If you look at the three aspects, all three always exist. The question is, which is the trigger, which is the fundamental aspect. It's perfectly possible that underconsumption is the trigger, but it's not the fundamental cause of it. And he's right when referring to the restriction in consumption. Of course, it's true that it then restricts any way of getting out of the crisis too. And the capitalist class is aware of it. Of course it's true. It's just as one capitalist wants to reduce the wages of his employees, and the capitalist next door wants the employees of the guy next door to have higher wages so that he can sell more. So there isn't a unity in the thing because there isn't a unity in capitalism. Anyway, the point is that underconsumption is a necessary feature of any crisis, but it's not the primary cause of it. In the case of Ireland, I think what one's talking of is a particular part of the world economy which effectively was subsidized by the EU. I think it's 5% of GDP came from the EU in the case of that country. Plus, of course, it received a number of large American firms like Dell, who have now moved out. The logic of that is if the EU doesn't go on financing it, it is effectively bankrupt. And there is no hope for it. Not that I want there to be no hope for it, but that is the way it is. That's the way the world economy is now being run. To a large degree, the optimism which was there, I always thought was fantastic. I just couldn't understand it. Because at most it was a branch economy. And at any point, the American firms could actually pull out, as they have from Scotland, of course. Again, that's another example of real crisis. And of course, subjectively, the people in Ireland were able to do it. Logically, you'd expect them to rise. And I've got great hopes that they will. So, but we go back to the overall theory. When one's talking about the falling rate of profit, it's actually highly complex, because if you go back and look at Marx, and not just the chapter I've quoted in the second volume of the Theories of Value, but the stuff on the falling rate of profit, it's absolutely clear that Marx didn't write it quite like that, because you just read the words there. It's clear that sentences just shouldn't be there. They're not put together properly. Now, that's because they were his notes and Engels just put them together. Now, why I'm saying that is that the question of rising productivity, which in itself conflicts with an actual declining rate of profit, is built into the concept of the falling rate of profit. Marx, when he talks of the rising organic composition of capital and its effect on the rate of profit, in the next sentence of the word, points out the rising productivity could mean the reverse. After all, why does a capitalist class put in improved capital? It's in order to get higher profits, not lower profits. So, logically, of course, you can have, and you have had in the last 50 years, a declining organic composition of capital with rising productivity. That has exactly happened. That's to say, the machinery actually costs less. Now, you would expect that to happen. After all, they're putting in more machinery to make more machinery. Now, you'd expect the machinery eventually to cost less. That is logic. You then have to have a theory as to why machinery becomes more expensive. Because, after all, the capitalist class is trying to produce cheaper and cheaper goods, as it were, to sell more and more, and it's trying to, in order to do that, it has to have a base which itself is cheaper and cheaper. So the logic of it is that you can actually get a position where you have a declining organic composition of capital with rising productivity, and so a rising rate of profit. That is perfectly possible, and has actually happened in the last 50 years. There have been articles on the declining cost of machinery, or the declining value of machinery in Marx's terms, or equipment, or whatever you want. So you then have to discuss why it is actually rising. Now, I think overall it's true. It is rising in relation to the number of workers, which is the point, because of course you can have a declining cost of the machinery, and yet the organic composition of capital goes up because fewer workers are involved. But you may not have that, of course. But then you have to explain how that will actually occur. Now, what David Yaffe's always insisted is that that will automatically occur. But it doesn't automatically occur. Now, when you're talking of the absolute collapse, I don't think that's part of Marxism anyway. And so I don't think that is at all necessary. But the argument of foreign profit doesn't do that. Because what it's stating is that over many years, maybe hundreds of years, you will eventually get to the point where machines make machines, and so therefore there is no value, and therefore there is no profit. That is logic, that ultimately, I think that's true. Ultimately, we will get to a point where machines make machines, and there is no value within the system. That is logic and why it is correct. And so what we're talking about is a long-term position, a long-term situation where the rate of profit would tend to fall. I think that's true, and I think it's true there is a limit to the rate of profit, precisely because there will be a limit to value for the reason just given. But it's not easily predictable at any one time, and I'm not at all certain whether one can say it exists in this crisis, partly because of what Cecile has said, but partly because it obviously contradicts the reality. It so obviously contradicts it, it's hard to say it, unless you're a cultist, really. But as a long-term feature, it is a necessary component of the labour theory of value. But it is long-term. Now, and of course there's another aspect to it, that social democracy, and in fact Stalinism, precisely saw to it that there were more workers around for machines. So where on earth do you end up with that? I mean, what the Conservative Party has always said is you don't need so many workers, etc. We can let justify them, have mass unemployment. But then, what do you conclude? I'm not absolutely certain, but if you have too many people actually working with the machine as compared to what you could have, what do you have then? Do you have more value or what? I'm not absolutely certain where one goes with that one. But anyway, that's the kind of almost dancing on the point of a needle you actually get into when you're talking about the falling rate of profit. As you can see, I spent a lot of time going over this in some detail. At one point, David Yaffe almost convinced me. It's something which I think is highly complex, and really one shouldn't go into. I don't think we should get involved in any more dancing around it, if you can put it like that. But the final aspect of what you're saying is, in terms of the third point, disproportionality. Well, I think, as I pointed out the last time I spoke when you were present, Marx, in Volume 2 of Capital, when he's discussing it, fixes the figures so that it works. I've been through them. We just look at them. That's to say, the interrelationship between the two sectors with the rising organic composition of capital. Now, if there's no rising organic composition of capital, there's no problem. But if there's a rising organic composition of capital, which over time there would tend to be, then two sectors simply cannot get together. It just doesn't work. At any time, upturn, downturn, wherever, it just doesn't work. Just try and put it through a computer and obtain it. It just doesn't. I mean, you can fix the figures so that at one time it works, which is what Marx did. What Marx was trying to say, well, look, it can work at certain times. Now, what one then ends up is not with the question of whether it works in modern capitalism, but really why it worked in Marx's time, because it did. I think we have to involve ourselves with that sort of question of why it worked then. And I think that the answer there is partly because of the nature of the rate of growth, partly because it was a relatively small industrial sector involved, and then it's interrelation with the world economy, probably. After which imperialism, Cold War, and so forth are successful in maintaining it. But if you take it out, just consider what's the capitalist going to do? He's going to reinvest. He reinvests in Department 1. So it just keeps expanding. But that doesn't relate then to Department 2. Well, what then? Well, the logic of it would be, if you have competitive capitalism, that he just goes on doing it and the thing goes bust kind of thing, and the sector's in trouble. But if you don't, then that doesn't happen. In other words, it partly goes bust, but only to a limited degree, not sufficient to bring the two sectors into line. If it were really to go bust to that degree, it would be an enormous wastage of this type, which to a degree we saw in the Great Depression, but it was very limited even there compared to what it could have been. But today they're not doing it. It just isn't being done. And that's really the point. They're preserving it precisely because it is the state controls it, the monopolies control it, they don't want to do it, and they're not doing it. The result is you do have a disproportion. And the result is they then, if they can't put it in there, they have to hold it. They have to find ways around it. That seems to me to be the position. I don't think I've answered your question fully, though. I think the thing requires quite a lot of exploration, because it's quite complex, both in the past and in the present. I remember raising this question with you many years ago, actually, and I think you were then in favour of the disproportionality argument, anyway.
Though not, I think, actually, the simple department, one department to disproportionality, but that there is created disproportionality in the sense of, for example, a massive overgrowth of too many railways.
Oh, right.
With too high an organic composition of capital in the railway sector, and then a lot of railways have to go bust, there has to be consolidation, there has to be cartels and monopoly in order to, because you can't just shut down all the railways and go back to horses and carts.
No, yes.
The rest of the economy is grown up on the assumption that there will be railways.
Okay, yeah, it's true. Anyway, what I was just going to say was that at the time you were supporting the Bolsheviks, who were very much in favour of the disproportionality theory. And this isn't meant to be part of your history. This is just an explanation of why I just raised it. And it was the Bolsheviks who actually raised it, and Preobrazhensky provided a detailed explanation of why it could work under certain circumstances. In his case, he provided another sector, the more backward sector, which acted as the extra market. Anyway, the point is, it's got a long Marxist history, as it were, and it's quite complex. But to finish with it, all three aspects are always present. The question is, what is dominant? It does seem to me now it's just this, the disproportionality aspect. The capitalist class can't invest where it can't invest, where there isn't a need for it to invest, in other words. It's not total like that, because there's always firms where you can invest something. There is some expansion. The point is the rate of expansion is greatly reduced. There is a surplus, therefore, of capital. That's the only point. Kondratiev's stuff has never been proved. I don't think there's very much to be said for it. Kondratiev, as pointed out, got his ideas from Trotsky and then misinterpreted Trotsky. But basically, the history, you can read it and see how it happened. Kondratiev produces a theory which is somewhere between Marxist and bourgeois theory. It's not Marxist, whatever it is. But usually people discard it because there is absolutely no proof. I mean, these cycles are so long, and they're so technical that who knows? It makes more sense if you want to look into cycles. Look at Trotsky's view of cycles, which is class-based and which is political. Well, I don't intend to go into Trotsky's theory, so I'll just actually leave it at that. But it does fit what Trotsky had to say. And Trotsky put it forward first in 1921, and then he consistently puts it forward for the next 6-7 years. Anyway, in regard to what was said by Cecile, yes, it's true that Britain, I think, is now the 6th most important industrial power in the world. Yes, of course, it makes, 2 million cars, something like that, even if they aren't owned by Britain. And the examples you produced are right. Though, interestingly, these are examples that you produce. At least 2 of them relate directly to the state. The National Health Service is very important in this, for the pharmaceutical companies, as well as for the medical equipment business, so which is what you were referring to there.
So I was referring to sales of scanners abroad.
Oh, scanners abroad, okay.
Not to the state. And sale of engines to private airlines.
No, yes, but you also talk to defence. Defence.
Yeah, to abroad, to the Saudis.
Yes, but it's the defence industry is part of the state apparatus, effectively, and is maintained by it. And they may sell abroad, they also sell internally. And they have a special relationship, effectively, which allows it to be the case. The pharmaceutical companies and the medical equipment companies sell to the NHS, and again, your point, I'm just supporting your point, but I'm just saying that one has to note that the state is absolutely crucial to it. In relation to Rolls-Royce, of course, it is a private company, but of course, if it had been saved by Heath, it wouldn't be a Rolls-Royce. It was precisely subsidised, financed, and kept. It went bankrupt effectively, and then was resuscitated by the state. And you're absolutely right. The relationship of Britain to America is really crucial in that, and it's quite clear that is one of the reasons why it is David Cameron's junior partner. The United States companies don't have to buy from Rolls-Royce. They tend not to, but sometimes they do. And the other company, by the way, isn't Boeing. Boeing doesn't produce engines. It's General Electric, which produces engines.
Pratt & Whitney.
Pratt & Whitney, yeah.
The last project.
Pratt & Whitney, I don't think it's...
It might be part of General Electric.
Yes, I was going to say it was actually taken over, but anyway, yeah. Okay, but you're absolutely right. It is monopoly and the state, effectively, which is crucial. In regard to John's point, which really 2 points, which really links with what you said. Yes, it's true. The Stalinism was still there, and social democracy was still there in the 60s and 70s. But 1968, as you point out, would never have happened if there wasn't a degree of independence from the Communist Party already. It clearly was. And the militancy of the 60s and 70s was contained by Stalinism and social democracy, but they didn't want it to be there in the first place. What it was an indication of the weakness of both, which is the only point. The fact they were there is true, and they did contain it. That's true. If they hadn't contained it, we would be living in a different world. That's true. However, they were much weaker than they had been, which seems to me to be the point. The second question is what the aim of the present government is. Well, I think we'll be talking about that tomorrow in some more detail. So I think that their aim would be defeat of the working class, and with that, a kind of return to the kind of economy that existed before 1914, the controls, which would be an absolute defeat, which would then permit I suppose, a boom of a kind, which most people would not actually get anything from, but would permit an upturn of some kind. I think that's what they appear to be going for. That's to say, what they're thinking is that now that Stalinism and social democracy is no more, or to a large extent is no more, or is defeated, or God knows what, they can return to a pristine capitalism. I think that's more or less what I think that's their aim. I'll try and discuss that next time. Well, tomorrow, the question of what happens if there is a defeat, it's quite obvious that the working class is not in a fantastic position. What would then happen? Well, certainly you'd have increasing disintegration and increasing despair. But then the question is what kind of defeat that would actually be. Obviously, a total defeat, a complete restructuring of the world, would then take many years to overcome. But I think that's very unlikely. So I think certainly a disintegrating economy and mass despair is quite likely, but I think there would be a limit to it. I don't think a complete defeat is possible. And to a degree, so I'll try and explain this next time, but to a degree what they're actually doing is committing suicide. I think the government's committing suicide. It's unlikely, in other words, they get the kind of defeat they actually want. It's much more likely either that they be defeated or that there's some kind of deal done, but which does not allow them to get to where they actually are. However, if there were to be a total defeat, it would be, if you can imagine a total defeat, it would certainly lead to disintegration and despair, but I think you're talking about not Britain, but the United States here. Even if there's a defeat here, it doesn't follow there'll be a defeat in the United States. So we'd have to see what would happen there. Though one could say at one level, it's more likely to happen in the United States, given the absence of a mass working class movement, or the relative weakness there of working class. On the other hand, the poverty, the number of people out of work, the absolute misery in the United States is greater than here. It's very hard to imagine the kind of defeat that they would want them actually getting, just given the enormous anger which would then follow. And even if they won, as it were, the Republicans come in, introduce all these measures, the likelihood is that after a very short period of time, you would get an enormous change in American society. It would be an absolutely crazy attitude to take, it seems to me. If they really weren't going to go to that, they really would commit suicide even in the United States. That's the way it seems to me. Talk about it in more detail. Thank you.